Now it's time to check the prevailing economic climate as we do each year. So without further ado, I would like to invite George Anjaparidze, the IATA Senior Economist, to the stage, who's going to give his... he's over there. Okay. George, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn, and good morning. My name is George Anjaparidze. I'm a senior economist in the IATA's Chief Economist Department, responsible for our work on air cargo, economic regulation, and climate change. It really is a pleasure to be here with you today to give you the economics update. My presentation will have 4 parts. I will start by giving you a macroeconomic overview, followed by an explanation as to why air cargo outperformed world trade this year. Following that, we'll look at the supply side of the dimension, looking at how the increases in capacity, fuel prices, and the pressure on yields are likely to have an impact on the strained outlook on profitability. I'll close by giving you a near-term demand outlook, as well as highlight some of our recent research findings. So let me start with the macroeconomic backdrop. Here, a tradition that's been established for the past 5 years has really repeated itself. Actual growth in the global economy came in below IMF forecasts again in 2016. And the promise of an upcycle and an uptick and acceleration that we've been promised for the last 5 years has yet to materialize. So it's times like these that make me think of a saying that an American economist, a quote from an American economist, Ken Galbraith, who said, "The only function of an economist is to make astrology look respectable." But hey, I'm not complaining. I get to go to interesting places like Abu Dhabi, meet fascinating people from all over the world, and work in an industry that I believe really offers one of the most important services to humanity and creates opportunities for billions of people around the world. But I'm not here to share with you my story. The reason you're here is because you want to hear about astrology. So let me move to astrology. So since 2012, growth in the global economy has been sluggish, growing between 2 and 2.5% per year, as opposed to the pre-crisis period of growth of around 3% per year. In 2017, we are expecting a moderate acceleration in that growth. Really, we are. And this time, it's for real. But the key issue has been the weakness in world trade. So world trade used to grow in the pre-crisis period at rates of about 1.5 to 2 times the growth rate of GDP. Since the 2010 rebound after the global financial crisis, global trade has struggled to keep pace with GDP growth. Actually, in 2016, world trade grew slower than GDP. Now, I'd like to also look at air cargo performance alongside GDP and world trade. And that's the blue line there where I've graphed the international freight ton kilometer performance. And we see that in 2016, actually air cargo outperformed world trade. That's only the second time that has happened since the 2010 rebound. So it's worth taking a closer look at 2016 and what explains the outperformance of air cargo compared to world trade. So here we can see 2016 performance, and what we see is that actually air cargo outperformed world trade considerably. In volume terms, over the course of the entire year, international freight ton kilometers grew at 3.8%, whereas world trade grew below 1.5%. So what explains this stronger performance of air cargo compared to world trade? Really, there are 3 things to keep in mind. First, there are structural factors. So we need to look at where the growth is coming from. Are sectors that are more dependent on air cargo growing stronger? Another structural aspect to this is, are businesses in some sectors becoming more reliant on air cargo? So those are structural issues. There are also cyclical aspects. So the pace of growth itself is a key demand driver for air cargo. And last, there's one-off factors that we need to keep in mind. So let's look at each of these in a little more detail. To start with, on the structural side, if we look at international FTK performance and world trade performance, we see that one of the reasons the international FTKs outperformed world trade is because we've seen a broadening of growth in the Eurozone. So what you're looking at is that blue shaded area shows the share of sectors that are growing in the Eurozone. The latest data from the European Central Bank shows that 80% of sectors in the Eurozone are growing. The pink line shows the dispersion of that growth. So it also means that growth is balanced across sectors. Now, in the Eurozone context, it's an economy that's an open economy that's quite heavily dependent on air cargo. So what that has meant is that it's had a favorable demand impact for air cargo growth. Another structural factor is looking at whether sectors and businesses have become more dependent on air cargo. And we've seen businesses be more reliant on global product launches. Think about Apple and the iPhone. We've seen stronger resurgence and stronger growth in e-commerce. And businesses have become more reliant on just-in-time production models. So as there's higher uncertainty in the economic environment, businesses have chosen to rely more on just-in-time production models. These are all factors that have had a favorable impact on air cargo. But there's also cyclical factors that we need to look at. So what I mean by cyclical factors is the pace of growth itself. And that the pace of growth itself is a key demand driver. During upturn phases, so when the economy is on an upturn, freight ton kilometer growth typically average 3 to 5 percentage points above world trade. That's because firms rush to replenish inventories and source components to build up production schedules. And that requires them to rely more on air cargo. In downturns, actually the opposite is true. Declines, in recessions, we observe declines in FTKs that are on average 5 to 7 percentage points below the growth of world trade. So during a recession, the speed of delivery of components and final products becomes less important. So let's look at 2016. In the second half of the year, we really saw an improving environment for emerging markets, led in large part by China. This acceleration in growth has helped boost air cargo demand. Now, air cargo is really the default transport mode of choice for perishables and high-value commodities. But crucially, it also serves as a solution in times of disruption. The Hanjin disruption may have actually had a favorable impact, a lagged favorable impact on demand in international air freight, particularly in the fourth quarter. A portion of the higher value and time-sensitive goods initially held at sea may have been served by air. But I really don't want to overplay this point, because when we look at underlying drivers for air cargo, they do look strong, but in the fourth quarter, this may have been a factor. What I'd like to do is really look at these three factors now from the perspective of how we see the growth in air cargo. And looking at air cargo performance of carriers by region of registration, we see how these factors played out. So this chart looks at 2016 performance, and it compares the performance in each quarter of 2016 compared to performance in 2015 in the corresponding quarter. Now, in the first quarter, we had a particularly weak first quarter. And that's in part because we had a particularly strong first quarter in 2015, but also actually there was underlying weakness in demand in the first quarter, beyond the fact that 2015 had a strong first quarter. But air cargo recovered and grew in the second and third quarter. That was driven by a broadening of growth in the Eurozone that shored up import demand. European carriers were best placed to respond to the growing demand. And the growth in European carriers here is shown by the green bar. In the third and fourth quarter, growth accelerated further, supported by a pickup in Asia, led particularly by China. So Asian carriers were well positioned to capitalize on this. And the growth in Asian carriers is shown by the blue bar. Also in the fourth quarter, the Hanjin shipping disruption may have had some favorable impacts. So all in all, when the year was said and done, the annual results show that European and Asian carriers, FTKs, explain about 64% of the growth that we saw in 2016. Middle Eastern carriers accounted for about 24%, and North American carriers contributed 11%. So that's really the macroeconomic backdrop and traffic performance. What I'd like to do now is talk about really the supply side and consider how increasing capacity, higher fuel costs, and yields, what impacts that's having for the profitability outlook moving forward. So let's start with capacity. Capacity additions in 2016 have continued to outstrip demand. One reason for this is the continued delivery of wide-body passenger aircraft. When looking at new aircraft deliveries in 2016, that's the last set of bars on the right-hand side, we find that actually almost 4 times as much payload capacity was delivered in the bellies of wide-body aircraft compared to wide-body freighters. So wide-body passenger aircraft bellies grew almost 4 times as fast as new freighters. This bulging belly, and actually it looks like a belly, that's bulging if you will, is contributing to the overcapacity situation on some trade lanes. Now it's fair to say that this is not an issue on all trade lanes. For instance, this is not an issue on the Trans-Pacific. However, a lot of the newly added wide-body belly capacity is being deployed in the Asia-Europe trade lane. Boeing estimates point that the freighters actually serve about 80% of the demand of this trade lane. So given the dynamics of the wide-body passenger belly aircraft coming into the fleet and where they're being deployed, we can expect that the relative importance of the freighter on this trade lane will diminish. Now that's not to say freighters will not serve this market, they will, but we can expect that share to decrease over time. On the capacity front, another key concern has been the rising in-service capacity of freighters. A lot of the freighters that were previously parked in storage have actually come out of storage as fuel prices have reduced since their recent 2014 highs. So that has contributed to the capacity challenge. While we're on fuel prices, let's look at fuel price developments. Jet fuel prices were in this high price tunnel between 2011 and mid-2014 of between $110 to $140 per barrel of jet fuel. They have declined significantly between mid-2014 and the start of 2016. But since the start of 2016, they've been on a gradual rise. In fact, fuel prices have risen more than 70% since January 2016 lows. So it's important we keep the fuel price dimension in mind when we're looking at yields. So sure, yields have been stable. So if you look at the blue line towards the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see that since December 2015, it's been fairly flat and actually even increasing somewhat in the second half of the year. But the increases in yields have not kept pace with the increases we see in jet fuel prices. Yields in Q4 of 2016 were on average 6% lower compared to Q4 of 2015. while jet fuel prices were about 8% higher. So if capacity increases have made it hard for yields to keep up with jet fuel prices, and if this persists, we can see how profitability outlook may come under further strain moving forward. So we've looked now at the supply side. I'll just move to the final part of my presentation where I just offer a near-term outlook on the demand side. And just to recap, sure, the global economy has stagnated, but there's room for cautious optimism for 2017, and we are expecting a moderate acceleration in growth in 2017. But it's important to keep in mind the risks. Risks do exist, but we do see the risks being tilted to the upside. On the upside, the US economy looks strong. Underlying drivers look resilient, and a confirmation of this assertion will be if we see a rise in the target US federal funds rate this week. In addition, the planned stimulative policies from planned interventions, from tax reform, regulatory overhaul, and infrastructure spending, all give room for further optimism, perhaps further down the road. In contrast, downside risks are significant in Europe. Risks are there if we see an unorderly implementation of Brexit, and the uncertainty from EU elections, if populist parties do well, do pose risks. Back to the upside, if we do see improving economic conditions, what we would see is we would expect to see a return of normal inflation. And what that could do is that could unleash corporates to spend the mountains of cash that they're currently sitting on. And that can provide a further stimulus to the economy. On the flip side, if we do see an improving investment environment in advanced economies, what that could lead to is capital outflows from emerging markets, which could add to instability and be bad for the overall global economy. So there's other risks listed there that I won't go through. The key takeaway from the slide really is that the upside risks have a higher probability. So that gives us room for cautious optimism for 2017. Having said that, if downside risks materialize, governments today are not as well positioned to deal with those risks because they have higher debt burdens and they've already used the tools that the central banks have to deal with those downside risks. But having said that, again, let me emphasize, we do see risks tilted to the upside in 2017, as we see the upside having higher probability of materializing. And that gives us room for cautious optimism moving forward. Let me take a quick look at some of the key demand drivers for air cargo specifically. And here, in the short term, the Purchasing Managers Index on export orders looks particularly favorable. This points to favorable factors in the short term. In the medium term, consumer confidence offers another source of optimism. So it can really serve to be a strength, a key pillar for air cargo demand in the more medium term, given that consumer confidence is near all-time highs, or given recent highs. So our expectations, keeping those factors in mind, our expectations for air cargo performance for 2017 is to see comparable growth rates that we saw in 2016. But also, let's not forget about government policy in improving the operational environment for airlines. And that can really have a further positive impact on growth. To help governments understand the true value of air cargo, IATA commissioned a research study that looks at the role of air cargo and smart borders, and how air cargo and smart borders help countries integrate into global trade, particularly global value chain trade. So I won't digress now to share with you the results of this study, but I would really encourage you to look at this study, which is available on our website and on our app. Our app is actually free to download and has other analysis as well, looking at market issues, industry trends, and public policy issues. So do check it out. The analysis is free, the app is free, it's a no-lose proposition. So just to sum it up, sure, the macroeconomy has stagnated since 2012, but we do expect a moderate pickup in 2017. However, a key concern remains weakness in world trade, although air cargo has recently outperformed. The rising capacity and increases in fuel prices are important to note. So yields, while they have been stable, the combination of rising capacity and rising fuel prices put the profitability outlook under strain. But on the demand side, we've seen a good start to 2017, and there's some positive tailwinds in the form of strong export orders and good consumer confidence. So overall, our expectations for growth in 2017 are comparable to the growth we've seen in 2016 for air cargo. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you a successful WCS. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Thank you, George. It's great to see that theme of optimism that Alexandre talked about in his State of the Industry has continued through to the economic analysis. I would like to encourage people to go through and have a look at the Global Value Chain Study. It does give some very good insights with regards to the value that connectivity can bring with regards to economic prosperity and growth in the air cargo sector. Just 1% increase in connectivity can translate into 6% increase in business as a result. So thank you, George, for those insights.